We showed you this he for she campaign video of UN Women because the next speaker, Gary Ford, is a he for she in every sense of the word. He's a revolutionary figure who has dedicated decades to the technological field within financial services. For over 35 years, Gary has worked extensively in the finance sector. He is an author of an Amazon bestseller, The Accidental Sexist, and a co-founder of Men for Inclusion, which is a company that advocates for gender equality and inclusion as a core part of his high-performing teams. And he led a men's allyship program at JP Morgan while he was working there. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Gary.
So, about 10 years ago now, I started to find myself on a fairly regular basis in a room with around 50 women, and I was often the only man. Now, the irony of being a straight white man in financial services, in technology, being the only one is not lost on me. Now, the reason I was there was because my employer, JP Morgan, had realized that technology had a real problem attracting and retaining women. And so they decided to create a gender network group just for women in technology. And I, as a managing director there, was asked to be one of the executive sponsors. So in that room, we were trying to understand, so why is it that women aren't attracted to careers in technology? And we were watching TED Talks, and we were looking at research. We were hearing from keynote speakers. And as we were having these conversations, a couple of things began to occur to me. Now, I, at this point, had worked in financial services technology for nearly 30 years, the last 20 of which had been leading teams of some description. I've listed a few of my notable accomplishments there. This is me at the grand opening of our Technology Command Center in 2015, a program that I had quite a lot of influence on. And I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I knew how to run large teams. I thought I led with empathy. I thought I treated people fairly and equally. Yet in that room, some of the things that my female colleagues started telling me about, some of the barriers and obstacles that they were facing, were things that I hadn't seen. They were invisible to me. So I realized that actually I was part of the problem. The second thing that occurred to me was the fact that if these things were invisible to me, they were likely to be invisible to all of my male colleagues. And they were hardly ever in this room having these conversations. So we decided to create a Male Allies program for women in technology. Actually, that was a woman's idea as well, but hey-ho, we'd take it. And one of the things we wanted to do, our primary objective, was to make sure that those barriers, those obstacles that the women were telling us about, were made visible to men in technology. And we basically built a set of workshops where we could have conversations about this. And one of the key things we didn't want to do was just turn up and tell them that there was a problem. This is one of the issues we have with unconscious bias training. It didn't seem to offer too many solutions. So we effectively tried to find ideas for how we can respectively disrupt, I've learned the keywords, those things from happening. So JP Morgan at the time had a very large technology division, about 50,000 people. So there was a lot of conversations to be had. But over the next 4 or 5 years, we rolled out this program into the UK, into the US, India, Argentina, Singapore. And ultimately, it got taken over for the whole business. There's now an Allies program across all of JP Morgan, and it's still going strong. In February 2020, I left JP Morgan to set up my own consultancy. About 6 weeks before the UK was locked down for the pandemic, the worst time in business history to try and set up your own consultancy. So I found out a little bit of time on my hands. So I decided to write a book. It's called The Accidental Sexist. And the reason being is that I kind of knew that there were other people maybe interested in this idea of male allies. Myself and Stephen Koch, who was one of my main allies partner at JP Morgan, had already spoken at a couple of conferences. This is me at the Women of the World Festival at the Royal Festival Hall in London in 2020. And we'd also helped a couple of other companies set up their kind of male allies programs. And then really fortunately, I met a really talented woman called Dr. Jill Armstrong. Now, Jill had just finished a 3-year research program into the different experiences of men and women in the workplace. This was at Cambridge University in the UK. And she'd surveyed or interviewed over 7,000 people across 35 different cross-sector organizations. And she found 16 things that consistently were happening to women in their careers that weren't happening to men. And these things were things that Stephen and I had discovered in all these conversations at JP Morgan. And we decided to call them accidental sexisms, because we felt a lot of the time these things weren't happening because people were ill-intended. I think most people, when they walk into their office, are actually quite well-intentioned. They want to do the right thing. But because of the way we are brought up to think in very gendered ways, these accidental mistakes creep in all the time. Now, I don't have time to talk about all 16 accidental sexisms, but I will share just a couple. We ran another survey about a year ago to see whether these 16 things were still happening. And actually, the survey was very focused on the financial services sector. And guess what? Of course, they're still happening. So I'm going to share a couple of them with you just to illuminate it. And they're kind of ideas that I think one or two people, earlier speakers, have already mentioned. So because of the deeply gendered way in which we are brought up, we often think about female strengths being really conscientious, showing great attention to detail, being really good at managing relationships, which often means in the workplace that we steer women towards very administrative type tasks and away from things which may be really career enhancing, which may be to do with clients and to do with P&L and to do with revenue. And Stephen and I found this at JP Morgan within technology, where it felt to us that our female engineers were often steered away from core development type roles and into more administrative or relationship-based roles like project management or business analysis. So when we did our survey, you can see the results, right? This idea of women being asked to do more administrative work, and let me make this clear, administrative work that's not part of their job, you can see that women are asked to do that far more than the men in their organizations. So another example, again, because of the deeply ingrained gendered ways we are kind of brought up to think, we often think about male strengths being more associated to leadership, being ambitious, for being focused on their careers, which means that we are far more likely to promote men based around leadership potential and nearly always promote women because of their past career history. And again, Stephen and I found this at JP Morgan, where it felt to us, we were both in a lot of promotion committees, and it felt to us like we were holding the women to a slightly higher bar than we were the men. And again, you can see this coming out in our data from last year, where twice or nearly twice as many women feel unsatisfied with the promotion process in their companies than the men. Now, our survey last year found that these accidental sexisms, all 16 of them, were still prevalent. There was often a 20 to 30% differential between that male-female experience. We almost call it like the lived experience gap. So about 2 years ago, I formed a company with a man, Mark Freed, who spent the last 20 years supporting women in their financial services careers. And we called it Men for Inclusion. And our primary goal with that business is to help companies engage with their men to help them understand why diversity, inclusion, and gender equality is good for them and good for their business. And you can see some of the companies we've started working with. And I'd just like to say, right, these are fantastic companies. JP Morgan is a fantastic company. I want to make that publicly on record. They were not doing really bad things here at all. But this stuff is really difficult to eradicate. If this stuff was easy, we would have solved it decades ago, right? So it needs more people to get engaged, more people to start actively pursuing it for it to be successful. Now, these accidental sexisms, as you'd imagine, we find that they are invisible to men. Interestingly, even when we show that data I've just showed you to men, A lot of them will say, that's terrible, but it doesn't happen here because we're really inclusive, right? So one of the things we often do is a bunch of research, and we research within the company, and guess what? We prove it happens in your company pretty much every time. As I say, these are great companies, right? Because this stuff is difficult. But one of the other things we do is we try to get men into workshops to have a conversation about this. And I think it's quite important that when you kind of bring them into these discussions, you don't start from a place where we are talking about blame, or we're talking about guilt. We are all the victims of our own gendered upbringing. I know that some people may not totally agree with me on this, but I think if you want men to be involved, I think you need to create a safe space for them to have a conversation. Because this is what this is. This is a conversation. This isn't getting men into a room and saying, you're bad, women are brilliant, you know, if we do all this stuff, women will win and you'll lose. That's not a great conversation. This has got to be about asking them what they do. Tell us about your experience. Tell us what you do to make these things better, or how you can make these things better. So we've developed a program, we call this a juice. It's what consultancies do. They make up acronyms, so they sound clever. And the A starts with this idea of awareness, but awareness in very specific things. The 16 accidental sections are really precise. So once you know them, you can respectively disrupt them. You also try and help them with this awareness of the fact that they may have had a relative advantage in the workplace if they were a man. Most workplaces have been designed by men for men. We then look at the desire to make change. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute and explore it in a little bit more detail. We then look at how we can understand how our behaviors continue to create these barriers, but also how we might begin to change things. We then look at how you can create capability so people know how to take action and almost practice doing it. And then finally, we look at how you can embed this in the business so it doesn't sort of like disappear when you leave the classroom. It's simply the way you do stuff going forward. So I want to talk a bit more about engaging men on this journey. And this is a bit of a journey. I think a lot of people refer to that. And I want to start with this point in the bottom left hand, if I'm getting this right, I think, maybe the right hand. Okay. It's not working for me, this, is it? But anyway, this bottom quadrant, where men normally are quite passive on this subject. And that's not surprising. A lot of companies start talking about diversity before they start talking about inclusion. So often men feel almost excluded from the get-go because it's not about them. But worryingly, we're finding more and more men are in the top quadrant. They're beginning to resist this conversation. I think McKinsey's research has shown that could be as many as 20% of men now think diversity initiatives have gone too far. That they, as men, are now the most victimized group in the workplace. Now, you can go to most companies and show them their demographic data and fairly easily prove to them that that's not true. But if that's what the men in your organization are thinking, you need to get that conversation out into the open. It's an important conversation to be had. You then have a bunch of men in this middle section. We call them reactive. There's not too many in here, but maybe they're getting involved because they've been given a target or because their boss has told them to do it. And then we reach the allies. Now, I've just spent a few minutes telling you how I became an ally. But in recent years, I've become a little bit more wary of the word. And I think sometimes, not always, but I think sometimes men as allies, they think that's about coaching, mentoring, sponsoring, training, supporting women on how to succeed in the current culture. And I don't think that's enough. There's one step further. And that's when leadership are coaching, sponsoring, mentoring, training men and women on how to succeed in an inclusive world, an inclusive workplace. And that's about challenging your own behavior and trying to change the culture around you. I want to talk a bit more about this idea of how you create desire in men for being part of this. And a lot of the speakers earlier have spoken about the business case. And it's absolutely undeniable. And clearly for executives, it is the conversation they need to have. They need to understand it. They understand this is fundamentally a business performance question. It's not necessarily a right thing to do question, although clearly it is. But for most people in an organization, the people that often are the setters of the culture, they don't care about the business case. So we need to find the personal case. What's in it for me? Why should I support gender equality? Why should I support diversity and inclusion? So we often find ourselves trying to help men and sometimes women with this conversation. And there are a number of reasons. I'm not going to go for every single one. But there clearly are things you can do that are connected to your own development. That's a real positive. Things connected to health and well-being. There's lots of research that shows, diversity and inclusive teams are happier. And let's face it, there is, in some countries, a mental health crisis surrounding men. There's often, and I think it was referred to earlier, this idea that these efforts have created far more flexibility, far more choice for men in the workplace too. They can work more flexibly. They can take parental leave. They can be a stay-at-home father. I couldn't do all that 30 years ago. And finally, there's this question about responsibility, about giving back. So for the men in the room, I'd like to just concentrate on two of these things right now. The first one is this idea about leadership. I fundamentally believe if you have aspirations for leadership, you need to be coherent and authentic on this subject. Because the leaders of the future, they're going to be good at this stuff, right? Inclusive leadership is simply good leadership. I fundamentally believe that. The second thing I'd just like to highlight is this idea of responsibility. As men, gender equality is good for us. All the research shows that. And we have benefited significantly from it in the workplace. But I don't think we've done much to deserve that. All of that effort, all of that work has largely been done by women and others from traditionally underrepresented groups. I think it's about time that men stepped up, put their shoulders to the wheel alongside their female colleagues, and did their fair share of the work. Because this is hard. If it wasn't, we would have solved it decades ago. Oh, don't need to do that. I'd like to just finish up with my motivations for doing this work. They're all quite selfish. I've embraced the what's in it for me quite wholeheartedly. And I do this for three reasons. The first is I think it helps me get better at what I do. I'm naturally quite introverted. I have limited emotional intelligence, as my wife will tell you. Okay? I find it difficult. I need to work at it. And having these conversations on a fairly regular basis, I think helps me become a better colleague, a better leader, a better friend, a better husband, a better father, a better human being. Those are quite good things. The second reason I do this is I want my family to be proud of what I do. All those amazing things I talked about that I did at JP Morgan, when I tell my children about that, I've got two daughters, you won't be surprised by that. They go, yeah, whatever, Dad, it's technology. Right? When I get up on stage and talk about this subject, in fact, my eldest daughter's in the audience, she's over there. She won't thank me for pointing that out. I have such an amazing feeling knowing that they are proud of what I do and what I'm trying to achieve. And then the third reason I like doing this work is I get to work with the most amazing people every single day. People who care, people who want to change the world for all the right reasons. And that is an absolute privilege. So I'd like to finish by saying a massive thank you to everyone in this room for turning up today. That matters. I'd particularly like to say a massive thank you to UN Women, to our Jung and Sohee and Hiechi, all the people that have really helped me become part of this conversation today. And particularly thank UN Women, because the work you do really matters. It is a privilege for me to be on this stage, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. But I just want to say a big thank you, because what you do is absolutely essential, I think, for the future of all business. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary, for this absolutely inspiring talk. Yes, your daughter is indeed proud of you. I actually did ask Gary's daughter just before the event, and she nodded. Yes, she's very proud of her father. So thank you very much.